to an album anniversary review here on Metal Band Chronicles, where true metal lives. Well, you know what? This one's a couple days overdue because this album actually celebrated its 40th anniversary on February 2nd. That's right, originally released 40 years ago on February 2nd in the UK on EMI Capital. What else could I be talking about? The sophomore album by Iron Maiden, of course. And of course, you know what I'm talking about. You already know what the hell I'm talking about. Especially if you follow me over on Instagram. By the way, yes, definitely check out Metal Band Chronicles over on Instagram. That's right, I've migrated over to Instagram because I'm sick of Facebook. But we are talking about Killers by Iron Maiden. That's right. I'll tell you what, 1981, 40 years ago, was a monumental year, wasn't it? You know what? Atari was coming into its own, you know? You had the arcade rooms starting up around 1980, 1981-ish. You know, hey man, it's the debut of Donkey Kong. The debut of a pretty controversial game for its time. I'm talking about Wolfenstein for Atari. You know, you had Raiders of the Lost Ark, the first Indiana Jones movie, hitting the theaters in 1981. You had the heavy metal movie also hitting the theaters, where you heard a early version of the Mob Rules from Black Sabbath. You know what, 1981 is full of a lot of stuff. But anyways, you know, the heavy metal movie basically being based off a comic book character, you know. Yeah, a lot of cool stuff. And in professional wrestling, you had the Nature Boy, Ric Flair, woo! Winning his very first National Wrestling Alliance NWA World Heavyweight Championship. One of 16 throughout his career. Now, technically 22, but you know, the other title reigns don't count for whatever reason. Wrestling, you know, that's a whole nother subject. But anyways, he beat the American Dream, baby, Dusty Rhodes, baby, for his very first NWA World Heavyweight Championship. So Dusty Rhodes was kind of going through hard times, I guess, once the Nature Boy Ric Flair beat him. Anyways, let's get on to our 40th anniversary review of Iron Maiden's debut album. What the fuck am I thinking? Sophomore album. That's right, Killers. Now, Killers, you know, there's 3 different versions of Killers. You know, now, you had the UK version, which I believe had 10 tracks on it. Yes, Twilight Zone was not on it. And you had the Australian version of Killers, which had women in uniform in the place of Twilight Zone. Pretty weird. And of course you had the standard American version, which had, you know, 11 tracks. Well, Lights of March being, you know, a short little instrumental. Yeah. So yeah, that would have Twilight Zone on it. Ironically, kind of weird. And one of the only tracks on the album written by Dave Murray. By the way, cheers to everybody out there. Little swig of beer. So, you know, we had a bit of a lineup change too on this album. Coming in on lead guitars to replace Dennis Stratton, who was on the debut album. None other than Adrian Smith. You know, formerly of a band called Urgent. which featured Dave Murray of Iron Maiden, actually, for a little bit. When Iron Maiden fired Dave Murray back in 1976 due to Dennis Stratton, I believe. Their vocalist at the time wanted Dave Murray out. But Steve Harris wanted Dave Murray in the band still. And, you know, obviously he would come back. And a couple years later, Adrian Smith would join the fold. In late 1980, actually replacing Dennis Stratton. You know, Stratton had left the band due to musical differences. He wanted to do more of a Pink Floyd, more melodic type of style of music, and that's not what Steve Harris wanted, and they parted ways, you know. And the legacy of the Beast begins. You get Martin Birch on the production. That's right, due to Will Malone doing the production on the first album. So that's kind of interesting in its own right, you know. And Martin Birch actually wanted to produce that first album, but Iron Maiden felt like they weren't good enough to have Martin Birch, you know, come on board to produce it. You know, ironically. But Martin Birch is here. Definitely a big step in production compared to, you know, the debut album, you know, that came out the previous year in 1980. You know. What else can we talk about? Well, at the time, I should mention quick too, Killers by Iron Maiden did not come out till June 6th of 1981 here in America. Have no clue why at the time, to be honest. Anyways, I think I pretty much covered everything leading into the actual album, so let's go. Now, notably, the opening track, The Ides of March, was originally called Thunderbird. Yes, and you can find Thunderbird on Samson's debut album, right here, Head On. That's right. Now, Thunderbird is an early version of The Ides of March. Bit different sounding now. The drummer, Thundersticks, is pretty upset, or was upset maybe at the time, maybe is even today, that he never got writing credits on it. Because at the time when Thunderbird was being written, Thundersticks was drumming for Iron Maiden. So this song predates, this little instrumental piece predates back to 1977. You know, before it was actually recorded with Samson. So, you know, Steve Harris naturally has a writing credit on Thunderbird too, which, you know, is Ides of March, as we know it, you know. And then we go into Rap Child. Now, Rap Child's another pretty old track for the time. Yes, Rap Child is one of them tracks that was actually written around that time too, in 1977. Yes. And you can find little 30-second cliplets here on YouTube of early versions of these tracks. They're very odd. I mean, the tracks are played much slower, you know. It's really weird, but it's interesting. It's an interesting piece of history. Just look it up on YouTube. So yeah, Rap Child, a short little track, you know. Probably the most well-known track off of Killers. Like Killers, you know, the sophomore album is definitely filled with deep cuts. I mean, when I saw Iron Maiden live back in 2005 at Ozfest, you know, they were only playing tracks from the first 4 albums. And the only track they played from Killers, well, besides the Ides of March intro, was Rap Child. You know, that's kind of interesting. So then we go into Murders in the Rue Morgue. You know, Murders in the Rue Morgue, again, is a pretty punky track. Now, I believe this track was originally written around 1979. You know, so it's a pretty interesting piece of history in its own right. And that's the thing, a lot of these tracks here on Killers were pre-written, which at the time kind of upset critics. I guess critics wanted stuff that was totally new, because Iron Maiden was already playing these tracks live before Killers even came out. I mean, they were playing these tracks live during the first album, you know, during that tour and that run, which is kind of interesting. So yeah, you know, Murders in the Rue Morgue, another great track, very punky, you know. And notably, you know, Paul Di'Anno does a very good vocal performance on this album. Definitely, compared to the first album, his vocals might be better on Killers. Now, I remember years ago before I discovered Killers, and I can't remember which book I was reading at the time, but the book I was reading at the time said that Paul Di'Anno's vocal work on Killers is weaker compared to the debut album. I so strongly disagree, because Paul Di'Anno sounds phenomenal on Killers, in my opinion. You know, I think he sounds a bit grittier on Killers compared to the debut album. So then we get into Another Life. Again, Another Life is another very early track that I believe was written around 1977 also, and performed with Dennis Wilcox on vocals. I think I screwed up and said Dennis Stratton. No, it was Dennis Wilcox who wanted Dave Murray fired from Iron Maiden back in 1977, and it happened for a little bit, and Steve Harris brought him back once Dennis Wilcox quit the band. But yeah. Anyways, Another Life is pretty interesting. It's definitely another punkier sounding track. There's a little fast speed metal-like interlude in the middle. It's pretty cool. Now we get to Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan, whatever you want to call it. Instrumental track, and it's quite unique. This track's pretty freaking aggressive for being an instrumental. Now Clive Burr, the drummer. Now I like Nico, but I think Clive Burr is a more technical drummer compared to Nico. So you get a lot of fills. You even get double bass work on Genghis Khan. It's a very fast track, you know. And notably, I'm going to mention this too. Near the end of the track, there's a little riff in there, you know, towards the end. You know, the riff that goes... Well, I'm going to point this one out right now to all you new metal fanboys. Papa Rhodes stole that riff. You know? That's right, Papa Rhodes stole that riff for their big freaking hit. And that's a fact, just listen to it. Cut my life into pieces. Such a dumb song. But that riff is stolen from Genghis Khan by Iron Maiden. Anyways, moving on to Innocent X Howl. Innocent X Howl, yes. Another great track, another awesome track. Now this track might be one of the very first Iron Maiden tracks actually ever written. Now, because I believe this track predates back to 1976. That's how old it is. Yes. I believe Steve Harris wrote this one in 76. And you can definitely tell, it definitely has more of a 70s feel to it. But it's an amazing track, one of my favorite tracks on here, you know. Great track. Now back to Genghis Khan real quick. Genghis Khan, I know I'm kind of fucking up, probably pronouncing it, you know. Notably, I think that might be an actual new track for Killers at the time, you know. I mean, it's an instrumental, obviously, but I think it is actually new for the time. I don't think it was ever performed pre-Killers, you know what I mean? But it's a great track. So then we move into the title track, Killers. What a killer track. I can definitely see why a lot of thrash metal bands are influenced by this track. It's probably the most aggressive Iron Maiden track. It's definitely aggressive. It definitely predates what would come a few years down the road when it comes to thrash metal, you know what I mean? this track definitely influenced bands like Metallica, Anthrax, Dark Angel, you know, even bands like Evil Dead, Violent, you know, Forbidden, you know, bands like that. So yeah, I could see why a track like Killers would have a huge influence on thrash metal, and why Killers might be a lot of people's favorite Iron Maiden album when it comes to the thrash metal realm. Because this is a more aggressive Iron Maiden album, you know, and it's more stripped down compared to, you know, what would come. And like I said, it's basically filled with deep cuts, you know. So then we get into Prodigal Son. Now, Prodigal Son is a very different track. It's more melodic. It's more progressive in a lot of ways. Now, this track, I believe, might actually be a newer track, too, that was written for the time. I think Killers was, too, the previous track. But yeah, Prodigal Son, you know, was written, I believe, just strictly for this album. It is actually a newer track that was written at the time. It's really weird, though, because it's more melodic, and it showcases a more melodic vocal approach when it comes to, you know, Paul Di'Anno. And the middle section, to me, reminds me of something David Gilmour would write when it comes to the guitar solos. Great trade-off melodic lead guitar work between Adrian Smith and David Gilmour on this track. I think it's a pretty underrated track. I don't even think it's ever been performed live, which is kind of weird. So then we get into Purgatory. Again, another early track. It had a different title. I cannot remember the original name for this track. And it's weird because I was just watching, you know, Jimmy K and the Metal Voices review on this, you know, for, you know, 40 years. And he said what the name of it was. I can't remember right now. But this is actually a very old track that goes all the way back to probably 77 or 78. Purgatory, yes. It's fast. Again, another proto speed metal, thrash metal type of song, you know. And you could definitely tell where a lot of thrash metal, a lot of German power metal would come from, you know. But it's an excellent track. So then we get into Twilight Zone. Twilight Zone, you know, a short little track. The only soul track written by Dave Murray. Really good track. Really, really good track in my opinion. Yeah, it's short, to the point. It's pretty fast. You know, it's got like that swing drum beat to it. And that's what Clive Burr was notable for. He'd done a lot more of the swingy drum beats, you know, compared to Nico McBrain. Like I said, I'm not knocking Nico. I think Nico's a phenomenal drummer, but I think Clive Burr was a bit more technical, and he had a different style to his drumming that made Iron Maiden sound a bit more aggressive. You know what I mean? So Twilight Zone, it's just short, fast, pretty punky sounding too. I like it. Really good track. And I love the album cover for the single. Really cool stuff. And we end the track off with another old track, Drifter. Drifter was written back in 1976. Yeah, one of the first Iron Maiden tracks ever written, actually. Pretty weird because it's pretty fast, you know. It's like, when I listen to Drifter, it's like Uriah Heep hyped up on speed. Because it kind of has that same formula, but played a little faster, you know. And I always liked the live version of this way back in the early days when Paul Di'Anno would do this, because he would go into this midsection where he would go, "Yo-de-yo-de-yo-de-yo, yo-de-yo-de-yo-de-yo," you know what I mean? Getting the crowd pumped it into. So I think that's kind of cool. And I think it would be cool if Maiden would bring that out again and play it live. I think Maiden should play a lot of these tracks live again, to be honest. You know, instead of just Rap Child. I mean, every once in a while, I guess they'll bring out Another Life or Murders in the Rue Morgue. I don't know. I wish I I would like to hear more of this played live. To me, this is a very great album. Now, I was a little late getting into this album. I'll admit, like, I remember seeing it in the record stores back when I was younger. When I was first getting into Iron Maiden in the late 80s. I mean, I remember seeing it in my Kmart. We had a store called Jamesway. We had Hills. I remember seeing, you know, all the Iron Maiden albums there naturally. And I remember seeing the first two there and looking at the back of the CDs and being like, hey, this guy don't look like Bruce Dickinson. He has shorter hair. And he has like a dress shirt on. I don't know what I was thinking at the time. I just thought he looked different. So it did take me about 8 years to get into the debut album, and Killers. And Killers was the first one I bought back in 1996. And it's weird because how I bought Killers back then is I was at my library at school back then, reading this rock book that was talking about like the history of Iron Maiden at the time. And this would have been 96. I was in 11th grade at the time. Wow, hard to believe it's been that long. And I remember reading about Paul Di'Anno. I didn't actually know the guy's name prior. And I'm like, Paul Di'Anno was the original vocalist for Iron Maiden. Of course, there was a few before that, before, you know, they got signed, you know. But yeah, I remember reading that and thinking to myself, interesting. And we used to have a, like an antique store, one of those drip stores. And this guy always got in a ton of heavy metal cassette tapes. He always sold them for $1. And I found Iron Maiden Killers in there. Same day I found Def Leppard's On Through the Night and I snatched them up. I took that motherfucker home and listened to it. I couldn't believe how much more heavier and aggressive Iron Maiden was on Killers compared to, you know, the albums I already knew, like Number of the Beast, Fear of the Dark, Peace of Mind, Seven Sons, you know, Power Slave. I couldn't believe it. Just an iconic album. It's hard to believe it's 40 years old. It's hard to believe it is 40 years old when you think about it. Legendary album. It definitely gets a 10 out of 10 in my opinion. Just legendary, man. That's my review of Killers by Iron Maiden to celebrate and commemorate 40 freaking years. That's all I got, man. More videos are coming. I know we haven't had many videos out. As of late, I just went back to work. We got stuff coming, though, you know. I'm going to review the new Cannibal Corpse track next. I got other things coming, too. Subscribe, man. Definitely subscribe. Hit the thumbs up button. All that cool stuff. Let's get to 400 subscribers quickly, man. Keep it metal.